Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the story of how I discovered the worst symphonist ever. I know we like to exaggerate. Critics particularly are prone to hyperbole, to exaggeration, but this guy is really, really terrible. Sadly, I do not have permission to play his music. It doesn't matter. I wouldn't have asked for it. It wouldn't have been worth the trouble. The person in question is Kurt Graunke. Here he is with a beautiful album photo from his 6th Symphony. And his dates were 1915 to 2005. Now, Graunke was something of a local celebrity in his native Munich, because he was the founder of the Graunke Symphony Orchestra, Symphony Orchestra Graunke. And that orchestra did quite a bit of recording work in the studio. They did film soundtracks, they did operettas and light music, lots and lots and lots of recordings with him as a conductor. And the symphony eventually became the Munich Symphony Orchestra, which is not the same thing as the Munich Philharmonic or anything to do with Bavaria or Bavarian Radio or anything like that. It was sort of like the Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra of Montreal that Yannick Nézet-Séguin has since trained to prominence. I wouldn't say that the Symphony Orchestra Graunke ever gained any kind of prominence, but they were quite well known in Munich. And if you bought soundtrack discs on labels like Colosseum, you might have actually owned something either conducted by him or played by that ensemble. Now, as a composer, believe it or not, Graunke, being German, wrote 9 symphonies. He had to, because he was German. And these 9 symphonies are the most miserable, absolutely dry as dust, completely bereft of inspiration, god-awful, toneless, tuneful, gray, drab, miserable pieces of music you've ever heard in your life. They're all in 4 movements. They basically follow the classical form with the scherzo placed third. There's not an original formal element to any of them. They're all scored for your basic classical orchestra with no added percussion for the most part. And they have, I remember vividly reading the notes to these discs where I think it was the 4th Symphony said, in this symphony, Graunke for the first time in his life employed the harp. I mean, God forbid that he should use a harp or anything else that might be mildly colorful given his predilections. And so I remember very vividly listening carefully to the 4th Symphony for the harp, and it's blooping and squealing and blipping along going, and all of a sudden you hear plink. Oh boy, that was the harp. Changed the whole piece. My goodness, what a radical innovation for Kurt Graunke to discover the harp. I don't know if he ever used it again. I really don't. But how did I find these things? It's really funny because those of you who are hardcore collectors like I am will sympathize. When I was a kid, I used to bicycle to downtown Milford, and next to the firehouse was Goodwill Industries, where people dumped things that they didn't want. And Goodwill Industries in good old Milford, Connecticut, for reasons I have never understood, had an absolutely spectacular used record section, and they sold these used records for a nickel. And in between Doris Day and Johnny Mathis and, all of those people and, the pop legends of the era, which I'm talking about now, the late 60s and early 70s, they had some classical stuff. And it was all mixed up. You had to just go through it. They had things like the complete Dvorak symphonies in a mixed cycle with like Talich and Shena and Ancherl and Neumann. Amazing stuff. They had the Bruckner Fifth with Gerhard Pfluger. I've mentioned that before in another video. I got all kinds of great stuff at Goodwill in very good shape. And so I was, just musically insatiable, but poor as crap. I made some money, washing cars and cutting lawns and doing the usual things that we did in the summer months to earn a little extra money. And I had a little allowance, but these were only a nickel. So I could get stacks of the damn things. And then if I didn't want to keep them, I could take them back. It was just to redonate them. It was a fantastic deal. So I was browsing through this stack of records, and there was this whole series of Kurt Graunke symphonies. Now, being just a child at the time, 11 or 12 or 13 years old, I had no idea who Kurt Graunke was. And I was too naive to assume that because I didn't know, because he wasn't a familiar name, that he was meaningful. I figured if you were good enough to write a symphony, and if that symphony was good enough to be recorded, then you must be a great classical composer. So I very intrepidly scarfed up all of the ones that they had. I don't remember exactly, because I don't have the LPs anymore. I don't remember how many of these things there were. I think there were 6 or 7 at that point, or maybe fewer, but maybe 4 or 5, because he kept writing them. The last ones, I think, were written around sometime in the 90s with the Ninth Symphony. So they didn't all yet exist. And they were on this weird label called Sedina, which apparently still exists in some form because the music is available. I've shown you the cover. Here it is again. The music is available as a download. It was available on vinyl. I don't see CDs, but I do see downloads. So you can audition 30-second snippets for yourself on Amazon or any of those MP3 services that let you play previews. And believe you me, 30 seconds is all you're going to want to hear. It really, really is. This stuff was just terrible. But of course, I pedaled home. I was very excited. And I plonked it on, and I listened to it, and I just went, oh. So that's Kurt Graunke, huh? So I figured, well, maybe he had a bad day. So I put on the next one. Oh. And so on and so forth. That's just how it went. They were abominable. And not because they're atonal. I mean, they are atonal, but it's because he can't even make up his mind to be atonal. There's good atonal and bad atonal. It doesn't make any difference whether you're tonal or not. What matters is whether you come up with memorable ideas and treat them with imagination and thereby create some sort of meaningful expression. Music was an emotional black hole. It was the acme of sterility. There was nothing, I mean nothing, that this music was trying to express. And the irony of it is that it was all composed by this guy who made his career recording film soundtracks and light music, operettas and whatnot. But his own music? No, of course not. He was German, and it had to be terribly, terribly, terribly serious. And serious it is. Seriously bad. Awful. I have never heard anyone who was so devoted to the symphony. And that's all he wrote. Basically, he wrote these 9 symphonies. He wrote a violin concerto. He wrote a string quartet. He wrote some short pieces because there were some couplings on the LPs. There was like 3 symphonic dances. Yeah, right. Yeah, like this guy really had the moves. You know what I mean? And there were some other short pieces and things. But essentially, as a serious composer, he left behind 9 symphonies. And I just think that they're the most terrible pieces I've ever heard in my life. And I urge you to go have a little bit of a listen yourself, because I'm sure they're available on streaming services, and you can go and sample them at will, and you will just be horrified. I guarantee it. The music is so nothing. It's not ugly. It's not pretty. It's not happy. It's not sad. It's just music of not. And I think as a result of this little talk and reminiscing about my days as a Graunkean, that I think we should do a series of bad symphonists, because there are a lot of them. This is the 20th century. I mean, 21st century, but the 20th century, everybody was writing symphonies. We talk about the fact that the golden age of the the classical symphony and the orchestra was in the 18th and 19th centuries, but that's not really true. The golden age of the symphonies was after Germany stopped writing them, because that's when the symphonic medium took off everywhere else. Everywhere. France, the United States, all the Scandinavian countries, because the orchestras existed. Until there were orchestras, you couldn't have orchestral music. And once you had orchestral music that could be performed, you had a venue, composers wrote symphonies. And so now there are tons and tons and tons of symphonies by lots of composers who like to think of themselves as symphonists. And the question of what is a modern symphony and how do I write one is extremely pressing, and it's just as pressing now. So I think it would actually be fun if you guys put out some names, and where I can get samples, I will. Otherwise, we'll just talk about them, of composers who never, ever, ever should have tried to write a symphony. Because, you don't have to believe in Mahler's dictum that the symphony must be the world, to understand that it's simply the highest and greatest form of orchestral or symphonic orchestral music that has yet evolved. It truly is. It's like the string quartet and chamber music. These are things that composers simply did their best work and their most expressive work and their most intense work in these media. And the symphony is one of those media. Therefore, composers who attempt to write them generally take the job very seriously and generally work extra hard. And I am sure that Herr Graunke did his very, very, very best to write symphonies that he deemed worthy of the grand German symphonic tradition. That he failed miserably at every single moment, without exception, is, that's something for posterity to decide. And so I'm suggesting, here we are. You're looking at him, posterity, and you folks are posterity too. And so let's start exercising our rights as posterior people to start determining who the good guys and the bad guys were from the last century. I look forward to you telling me who you think the worst symphonist, just give me one name at a time, the worst symphonist of the 20th century is. And if I agree, and this is purely a personal thing, I confess, I will do a future talk on that disastrous composer and his pathetic efforts at joining the pantheon of great symphonists. But until we get to that point, I'm just going to leave you with the task to go out and sample any of the symphonies of Kurt Graunke. You will be so depressed when you're done. I guarantee it. But that in itself can be an educational and entertaining fact. So keep on listening, folks. Thanks for joining me. Let's see where this particular adventure goes. Take care.